Welcome to this episode of the Law of Relevancy podcast. I'm Cord Zoen, your host, and today we're joined by Tom Schwab. He is the founder and CEO of Interview Valet. In a sense, he is the thought leader of thought leaders when it comes to podcast marketing. Tom, thank you so much for joining us.
Cord, I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, it's quite an honor to even have you on our show, because I have a lot of respect for Interview Valet. We get a ton of our interviews and a ton of our guests on this particular podcast through Interview Valet. Tell us what it is and what inspired you to start the organization.
Yeah, if you look back, things are always evolutionary, not revolutionary. So my last business was HubSpot's first e-commerce case study. And we built that up from a regional player to a national leader, sold that. And then people would say, well, how did you do that? Well, we did it with guest blogs. And by 2014, guest blogs really didn't work that well anymore. And so I hypothesized that you could use podcast interviews like we use guest blogs, right? To tap into that audience, to get that know, like, and trust. So we started to beta test it. I wrote a cheesy little PDF that I gave everyone, did a course that I never took out of beta. And our early testers said, I just want to be the guest. You take care of the rest. And in fact, one of our early beta testers bought me the name Interview Valet and the domain and gave it to me and said, this is what you need to do. And for the first probably 3 years, I do my elevator pitch and people would go, what's a podcast? But as podcasting took off about 2019, our business did too. And so we're connecting thought leaders and business and health and wellness, brands, a lot of nonfiction authors, coaches, consultants, category designers, and really introducing them to their ideal customers. Because we'll talk about this today, but I think this idea of breaking through the noise has gotten to be laughable, right? Everybody's yelling, nobody's hearing. I'd rather get in on the conversation.
Exactly. The carnival barkers of today. It's the yes. Sunday, limited time, come down to the lot. That stuff never works. But you talked about know, like, and trust, and really that cuts to the foundation of what marketing is. As a thought leader in the podcast space, tell us about how podcasts are just an ideal platform for know, like, and trust.
So what is marketing? Right? I spent way too much time and money probably getting my MBA in marketing later in life. And it's something that my grandfather, God rest his soul, he could have told me what marketing was. It's a way to start a conversation with your ideal customer, right? And you think of all the marketing that you've ever done, whether or not it's a Super Bowl ad or a newspaper ad, all of it is to start that conversation, to get them into your ecosystem. And as I looked at that, it's like, well, what's the most efficient way today to do that, right? To have a meaningful conversation. And really the idea of podcasts, and it's not for everyone, right? The average podcast listener is above average income, above average education, but if you're trying to target those people that are thought leaders, that are early adopters, it's a great way to get out there. And, today more than anything, I think there's a difference between a transaction and a relationship. And right. And if all you're trying to do is transaction sales, $7 here, $3 there, everything in internet ends in a 7, right? But if you're trying to build a relationship, build that lifetime value, especially B2B sales, man, that takes a conversation. And to me, podcasts are a really easy way and effective to do that.
Yeah, I remember back in the late 90s when I was still in college and I was interning with this marketing consultant, that he would consult to radio stations and help them do programming for the types of music that they would have at those stations. And I learned in those days, to me, some of the foundational lessons of like what branding really was. And we were doing some very early like email blasting. There weren't even like a lot of choices of what platform you could use to even send out lots of emails. It was before even lots of spam that was out there. It was very, very early. I want to say this was like 1997. And I remember him telling me that radio listeners, and this is back when radio was really, really still popular. It was before a lot of the consolidation, or is during a lot of it. And when you can have a relationship with people at scale, it's unbelievably powerful. And listeners to disc jockeys, whether it was a morning show or an evening show or weekend thing or whatever it was, it's like they literally, people, like there's something about our psychology that makes us believe that we have a relationship with these people, that where you're listening. And it's not wrong. It's just a matter of fact. It's like the platform. And podcasting, in my opinion, is even better than that, because there's really no time limit. It's not like we have to stay within 30 minutes or a 3-minute block. A podcast can be as long as it needs to be.
And I think in this post-generative AI world, that is even more important, because so many times we get something, if it's an email or something else, and you're like, oh, that was written by ChatGPT. Or your first thought is this a real person? Whereas I think the collaborative content that we're having here, people know it's real. They know it's authentic. I guarantee you, ChatGPT is going to sound a lot smarter than me, speaking complete sentences, because humans don't do that. And it's interesting today, where there's a lot of talk now about it's not search engine optimization anymore. It's language machine optimization, because the ChatGPT, Gemini, all of those, they're listening to the content, and they're listening for share of voice, who's out there talking about things, and then also the sentiment, right? Is it positive or negative? And we've seen a lot over this last couple of months, the summer of 2024, where people that are on podcast interviews are showing up in results for ChatGPT. And to me, that's like, man, if I can get ChatGPT to be my best referral engine, I'll do that all day long.
You really are talking about the future of search. I mean, there's tools out there like ChatGPT, like Perplexity, that are going to replace Google. The whole theory of putting in some keywords and trying to string together the right query, that's over now that people can have really effective conversations with these bots. And so that's really encouraging to hear. Some of that I didn't know, Tom. I didn't know that podcasting was showing up in search queries for large language models like that. So that's unbelievably valuable information. I do have lots of customers that come to us as a marketing agency to ask us for help with their podcast. And so I wanted to dig into that a little bit, because a lot of the people that listen to this show, they are considering starting their own podcasting. They're trying to figure out, is it worth it to do a podcast? Clearly, your platform helps both sides. It helps podcasters and people who want to just be guests. But what goes into making a good podcast? What is the strategy? What happens at the beginning of that process?
Yeah, and I think if you take a step back, people will say, should I be a guest or a host? Well, it's not an either or. It's what are your goals for it? It's almost like, should you be an Uber driver or an Uber passenger? Well, what are you trying to get out of it? So I always look at it, guesting is a way to go out there and get new exposure, to get new audiences, to get new backlinks. Hosting is a great way to build your current customers, right? To nurture them, to build your current leads. And I think, like so many other platforms, the key to success is hard work. And, there's a lot of times where people they think they're overnight wonders, right? But they don't realize there's that consistency, right?
Right.
That they show up week in and week out. And the thing in podcasting is that 80% of podcasts die within their first 10 episodes. It's called pod fade. It's one of those things where it's really easy to start, really hard to keep going over time. The other thing is, you'll have somebody like Gary Vaynerchuk that tells you everyone needs to have a podcast. And then there's other people that says no one needs to have it. And I think the idea is the world doesn't need another lousy podcast or a copycat of a podcast. They need something fresh. And that could be the same way for whatever it is you're doing. The world doesn't need another knockoff singer of just doing cover bands, right? They need a fresh voice. And so I think you have to start with, what are your goals for it? What are you trying to do? What unique point of view do you have? People talk about the riches are in the niches. Well, the audiences are too, right? Just have a generic podcast, unless you've got already a huge, huge following, right? People forget that Joe Rogan was well known before he started his podcast.
Right.
I think when people start podcasts, one of the things I always ask them is, what's your goal? Who do you want to talk with? Right? What's your focus? Is that going to be? And then really, I'll ask them, what's your plan for the first year? Because you want to have that thought out before you just hit record and publish.
Well, let's dig into that just a little bit. And this might even come right from your sales deck, but let's just hypothetically take a customer or someone who's aspiring to be on podcast, and maybe they're in high net wealth financial management. What types of podcasts would you suggest for somebody like that?
Yes. And that's a great example. You always want to fish where the fish are, not where the fishermen are. And we've had people come to us before and say they're financial advisors. They want to work with high net worth or uber net worth people. And the first thing they'll say is, I want to go on this retirement podcast. I want to go on CNBC. And it's like, well, if you go on that retirement podcast, isn't that person a competitor of yours? Why would they want to have you on? Or if someone is listening to CNBC 24/7, don't you think they probably already think they're smarter than you? So why would they need you? So don't go where the other fishermen are, go where the fish are. And then we start to ask them, it's like, well, what are your clients like? And they're like, well, I can think of someone here that we've worked with. He's based out of Wisconsin. And he's like, I work with a lot of farmers. I work with a lot of blue collar businesses here in the Midwest. And I'm like, do you think they're listening to CNBC all the time? No. Okay. What podcasts are they listening to? And a decade ago, it was probably more podcast guessing than podcast guesting. Now we can actually have the data. We can find lookalike audiences. So we can find about all these people that go to this conference or this website. Here's the podcast they subscribe to. And we can start doing that. And, if you go to a podcast that business owners listen to, and especially, say, older business owners, well, those are also people that are the high net worth that aren't thinking about retirement all the time, but you could bring into the idea of what are you doing to build wealth and not just your business. So that could be some of the powerful ones. I can think of one where this gentleman was a business coach and he worked with people that were, 40 to 50 and work-life balance. And he had been on some podcasts that were all about coaches. And he came to us and we're like, oh, we think you would be on this great one called 40 Plus Fitness. And he's like, I'm not a fitness coach. I'm like, no, but your audience listens to this, right? These are men, 40 plus, that their life has been out of balance, right? They've been spending so much time in their career that their health has done it. And I can still remember when we were prepping them for it, one of the things that we talked about is, talk about it does you no good if you make your first million by 30, if you make your first widow by 40, right? There's got to be some work-life balance. And of course, that podcast converted better for him than any other one, because he was talking to the people that he wanted to work with and it resonated with them.
Well, let's talk about a little bit of the tone that happens in that conversation too, because if you're coming on to a fitness podcast or a farming podcast and you are, let's say, high net worth financial management type of an organization, I would imagine that you just don't want to hit it on the nose. You kind of want to resonate with the conversation that's already happening, right?
It is. And I learned so much from our clients. And I can remember years ago, my previous business, I was covering the phone at lunchtime and a happy customer called up and he's like, I love you guys. You're just like Preparation H. And I paused and I'm like, we're like hemorrhoid cream. And he's like, no, it's a compliment, right? He's like, you gave me fast relief. You came recommended. And it struck me that we're all selling Preparation H, right? Nobody cares about your product or your service. They care about their pain in their rear end. And so when you go on these podcasts, you have to let people know that you understand their struggles. And one of the best ways to do that is to tell stories, right? We worked with this client and he had this struggle. We helped him with this, and now he's at this place. And then tie it together with sort of a theme or a moral. So if you've got this challenge, right, you don't have to live with it. There are ways to solve it, and that's what people remember. Because you think about podcasts, the data says that 70% of people that listen to podcasts listen to it sped up. So if you're in the financial area and you're starting to throw out numbers and things that should be on charts, no one's going to remember that. But if you tell them a story that resonates with their heart, they will not only remember it, they'll take action on it.
I mean, it's literally how our brains are wired. We're literally wired to retain stories and to remember them and to associate those stories with people that shared that story with us. It's how like our history was passed down for millennia, right? So I would love to hear, and it's one of those things that I actually tell a lot of times before a podcast in prep. I tell my guests, because the impulse, the normal thing to do a lot of times is to have like a lecture, is to come on here and talk about, your expertise or whatever. But that stuff just kind of fades away and it makes people change the channel. But telling stories is so much more powerful. So can you think or share a story of someone you've worked with that either was trying to start their own or trying to become a guest on podcasts where it worked really well? Because I definitely want to use some of this to help encourage people to do this type of self-branding and branding for their organization.
And it's the idea that people come to us and, like you said, they're either overconfident or underconfident. And both of them are problems, right? There's the people that say, I know everything, everyone will want to listen to me, and I'm just going to do my keynote speech. Nobody wants to hear that. Nobody wants to be lectured. The flip side is that we get people that come to us that say, well, I'm not an expert. What would I talk about? And let me share my personal story. When I first started out, I had this challenge of, well, I'm not really an expert. And it was a friend of mine, a great podcaster that shared with me what that really means, right? Nick Pavlidis is the gentleman's name, and he's a retired lawyer, a reformed lawyer, as he would call it. And he said the legal definition of an expert is someone that knows more than the average person based on their education, their training, their life experience. And he helped me understand that there's really three types of experts out there, right? There's the PhD, and that's the person that's going to lecture and has all the research behind it. That might be great for a college class, but it doesn't really work on podcasts.
Right.
Then you've got the Sherpa, right? Maybe that's the person that has been up and down to the mountain forever, right? They've got the 20 years of experience and they can tell you everything. Sometimes that doesn't resonate the best because, well, the person doesn't understand me anymore. And he said that you've got the person that's like one step ahead of you that has learned the lessons that you can still relate to. You think of the person that understands fourth grade math is an expert to the person that's trying to figure out second grade math. So I think sometimes, on podcasts and experts especially, do you really want, if you're starting out as a business, right? Do you want to be lectured to by a PhD from Harvard? It's not that applicable. Do you want to hear from Elon Musk on what he did? It's probably not that applicable, right? We're not him. But if there's someone that's slightly ahead of you that understands your lessons, that's much more relatable. And one of the things that helped me understand is the fact that we're all blessed to be a blessing, right? We know something that we can share with others. And the sad part is most of the time we underestimate what we know and overestimate what other people know, right? So one of the things I remind myself, I remind our clients is what's ordinary to you is amazing to others.
Yeah, that's really good advice. It's somewhat related, but I was thinking of something that someone told me the other day, and they said, if you just go and you ask people for money, they'll give you advice. But if you ask them for advice, they'll give you money. And a lot of times people come to us because they see that, our podcast studio looks nice, the way that we frame it, everything else. I see some of the things that like we've done and some of the technical aspects of like what you're doing, even in like your particular frame in this moment. Like, for example, you've created contrast between yourself and your background. You do have some lighting in the room that you're in. You have a professional microphone. You have, the ability to hear what I'm saying through your headset. There are some technical things if you are in market to start a podcast that you don't have to be an expert in. I sure as heck made a lot of mistakes early on trying to do it myself. It wasn't until that I actually hired people to help me with it, people who are experts in set design and lighting and things like that, that it actually started to look great and sound great. And so I would encourage anybody who is thinking of starting a podcast or being on these podcasts to get some help from some professionals to help make the quality of their visual or their audio just be as good as it could possibly be.
I agree with you on that. And once you see how the magic trick is done, it becomes easy. Somebody can show you, this is the kind of microphone you need. This is how to use it. Here's how you can set up your studio. There's little things that make a big difference. The other thing that you mentioned was video, and your background looks amazing. Today, 90% of podcasts include video. Pre-COVID, it was less than 10%. And I encourage people, when you present yourself with your audio or your video, don't try to be good enough for today, because what's acceptable today will be laughable a couple of years from now. And I think if we go back and you look at some of those Zoom calls, you can like say, oh yeah, that was definitely at the beginning of COVID. And it looks very, very dated with that. So make sure your audio sounds good. Make sure your video looks great. The lighting looks great. Even the camera, right? Most of the cameras now that come with the newer computers are great. But if you're serious, a 4K camera or a DSLR camera can give you that depth of field and really make you look professional, not only today, but for years to come. And there's other things, the mic flag, right? The not so subtle branding that you can do in that. And all those little things make a difference.
Yeah. I agree with you. And I think that video is a really important part of any podcasting that you're thinking about doing, because when you see somebody and you see that the way that they're actually interacting, and you talk about the humanization of like this post large language model, generative AI world, when you see them on camera and you can tell that they're presenting with like authentic and original thoughts, it's a lot different than just an audio transcript or listening to the audio podcast. I mean, a lot of times people are watching and listening to this stuff in the cars, but if they do see you, even if it's for a short period of time, and they see your camera and they see you're a real person and they can identify with you, it can add a lot more value to your podcast, in my opinion.
Yeah. And I think today we all think our first thought is that that's AI generated. And I think the search engines do too.
Yeah.
And they're looking for clues that it's not. So when, I grew up in Chicago, I drop my G's in words. When people hear that, it's like, oh, that's real. Or when you were just talking, right? You just adjusted your shirt. No AI is going to do that. People see that and it's like, oh, this is a real person. And I think that collaborative content is so powerful. And you even see this in the search engines now, right? They're looking at everything. So they can tell, is this a real background or is it AI generated? And even in social media, there's some talk where if you put a picture up with multiple people and it's a real it's a real picture, it's not the Eiffel Tower behind us, that gets more, not only engagement, but gets promoted more, because it's like, okay, this is a real person next to another real person. And, they're doing facial recognition, whether or not you tag somebody in it or not. And so all of a sudden it shows up in other people's feeds too.
Well, let's just broaden it a little bit. Let's talk about the opportunity of podcast marketing as an industry, right? So what is the trajectory of the industry right now? Like, how many podcasts are out there? What are your opportunities to leverage podcasting as a brand? What advertising opportunities are there, even outside of being a guest or a host? Like, what do you see happening out there in the podcast world?
Yeah, it's the whole time, the idea of podcast, I think we're recording this in 2024. Who knows, maybe in 2030, somebody laughs every time they hear podcast, right? Because what is a podcast? It started from something that was on an iPod. At first, it was just audio. And now it has really morphed. People will say, well, I don't listen to podcasts, but I watch Joe Rogan on YouTube, or I hear his snippets on TikTok or Facebook. Things now are transcribed. There's snippets to it, the repurposed content. So to me, podcasts are more on-demand creation. So you can create it, you can repurpose it into other areas. So I think it's so much more powerful than just podcasts. The other thing is that I think people are striving for authentic conversations, not things that are the big media has said what they want in there, or just taken snippets and over edited them. I think they long for that connection. So I think the people that can get out there are going to be heard by their clients. They're going to be heard by the large language models. They're going to get that share of voice, and they're going to get talked about. One of the things that we have seen so much over the last probably 18 months is we advise our clients, don't just do more podcasts, do more with your podcasts, because you can get a month's worth of content from every interview, right? You can take this conversation, you can slice it and dice it, make reels, make shorts, make blogs out of it. It's such a rich form of content. And a lot of people will say, well, I wish I could make as much content as Tony Robbins or Gary Vaynerchuk does in a day. And I'm like, you do, right? We're all making the same content. The difference is they're capturing it and then repurposing it and promoting it. And we can do the same thing, right? You take this, record it, and can promote it out to the audiences. So I think it's really the future of marketing, and a more of a theory and a strategy of how to use the content than just a tactic.
That's really impactful what you said. That is 100% true. And it's when people think about the phone calls you have, think about the meetings you're in, think about how you speak about your organization or your products, your services. Every single day, people are creating tons and tons of content. I remember what inspired us to even start this podcast was that we learned early on in our attempts and experimenting with video and audio that I can ask a client to write their website copy, like, hey, can you give me some about copy? I just need, 800,000 words, 1,200 words, something like that about your business. And people would just struggle with it really hard. But if I just had a conversation about their business, it was just pouring out of them, like without even any kind of a struggle or trying to put pencil to paper, any of those sorts of things. And just the format itself. And so what we did is we looked at it and we were going like, man, like we just need to demonstrate this for our clients, like how this isn't that hard. Like if you let us take care of some of the technical pieces, you're an expert in stuff that you talk about all the time anyway. So why not stay on topic and just let us help you and coach you along? It's not that difficult. And now we're over 100 episodes into this podcast, and it's working for us. We're generating business from it. We're educating people. We're having fun. I enjoy it on a personal basis because, God forbid I ever, get hit by a bus. My kids will be able to watch these videos and like learn from dad. there's lots of benefits to the whole thing, and it's not that hard. The only thing that I would say that I do share with people when they try it, it's like you said, the consistency piece. It's around 10 episodes, people either quit or stay with it. But I would also offer that it seems like around 10 episodes, people start to get comfortable enough to get good at it. It seems like around 10 to 15 episodes, the quality of the actual conversation itself gets to be a lot better and more listenable.
I agree with you. And people will say, well, I don't like the sound of my voice. Well, you don't have to listen to it. You probably should to watch your own game film. But the worst interview you're ever going to do is your first one. The worst podcast you're ever going to do is your first one, right? We all start somewhere. And just that beginner's mindset. And I think, especially when we get older, we get more professional, we get more accomplished. It can be beneficial and helpful to try something new, to start something new and get better at it. And the other thing that I love about podcasts is it's not a gotcha media. Right? If you're on a podcast, it's not like going into 60 Minutes where they've got the camera in your face and they're trying to get a soundbite. Most hosts, they want you to look like a great guest. They want to put you in a great light. When guests come on your show, they're thrilled to be there. So we'd be having the same conversation if you and I were sitting down in Tampa today having a cup of coffee. The only difference is we're recording it and letting the world listen in.
Yeah, no, I really enjoy this. And obviously you're an expert at it. You have a whole organization around it that's doing a phenomenal job helping people that are trying to get this content out there. Tom, where can we follow you, learn more about what you're doing with Interview Valet?
Yeah, and here's a little behind the curtain. 9 years of studying on this, it's always best to send people to one place, right? Evergreen site for an evergreen traffic. So if you go to interviewvalet.com/LOR for Law of Relevancy. I'll have all of my contact information there. I wrote a book called Podcast Guest Profits, How to Grow Your Business with a Targeted Interview Strategy. You can buy it on Amazon, or if you go there, I'll send you a free copy. I have all my social media there and my calendar link. So if you'd like to talk about how you could use podcast interview marketing to grow your brand and grow your business, I'd love to talk with you.
Thanks, Tom. We're going to check that out. We really appreciate you coming on the show today. And you can find us anywhere where podcasts are found across the entire web, social media for Law of Relevancy and Bake More Pies. We appreciate you coming on the show. We'll see you guys next time.